All right, so we're going to start in today with exercise 130. We made it to day 30 of class. That means there's only a week left next week. So most of next week will be catching up and making sure you finish all the things that haven't been finished yet. I'll try to have a grade sheet to you next Monday. If I can, I'll get them out today, but I don't know if the printers I've spent all morning trying to print, so you can't make any promises. But I will for sure, even if I have to print them at home, have them for you next week, so that you guys can look where you are and make sure you catch up on all the stuff you haven't done. So today is kind of the culmination of all the stuff that we talk about. It's the ultimate collage in Photoshop. It's the architectural perspective. So we take the model that you've been making, we drop it into an actual scene. We put in people, we make it look like the big showcase piece. And the reason that I saved this for last is because this is ultimately the one that is really big on your presentation, that shows your whole design. It's the key view. It's the really fun one to do. And I would be lying if I didn't tell you that this is probably my favorite one to do. So it's definitely a fun one. I will probably today in the course of lecture go off on some tangents of doing a few random things because I feel like it's the last time where I can show you, oh, you could do this and you could do this, and why not try this? So fair warning, I might ramble a bit, but this is the fun one anyway. I am also going to try to set myself up with a really challenging one, just for the fun of doing it and so that you can see the kinds of things that we can ultimately do. With any of these projects, we're using imagery that comes from Flickr or from Google Images or whatever to try to provide the background imagery. If you had an actual site where you visited, you would take photographs of the actual site and you'd have the photographs to work from. So this is a little bit, is the site that I'm going to pick actually our site? No, right? Because I didn't go there, I didn't take a picture of it. We're going to go with it. And pick one that looks good for the challenge of what happens. So in this, unlike the other examples where I started in SketchUp, in this I'm going to start by looking for my image. And so I went ahead and did a Creative Commons search I put in Yosemite Meadow, but you really whatever feels right to you. And then I went through and I started looking at pictures. And it takes a while and it takes several pictures to go through to try to figure out. I'm looking for an image that would be nicely composed where I could see my building sitting as part of this scene, right? So something like this would be pretty nice. I could set my building up right over in here, have the little creek meandering next to it. It could be a pretty good composition, right? This one looks like it's a little small, a little oversaturated. I'm not going to do it. The other thing to pay attention to is what about the general lighting conditions, right? Where are the shadows coming from? Can you match that up to your building, right? So we want to think about that piece of the puzzle too. So something like this, with the moonrise and the fog, would be a pretty fun one. But this isn't the kind of lighting that I have set up. I didn't do a V-Ray rendering of it, so I don't have lights inside my building, and I'd have to fake all the lighting, which would be a little bit more challenging. I'm not going to do that, okay? But you could do something like this, right? As we move on, something like this has the little path going through it. This one would be a relatively simple one. You could probably put your building somewhere in the middle here, use this as the path that leads up to your front door. Okay, that wouldn't be too bad. Right? You saw this one, I pulled this one up first. This one is not the closest image, but I want to have the fun of having the reflection and having to do the reflection. So this is the one I'm actually going to do it on. But I'm showing you these as examples. Any of these would work. This one's pretty nicely composed as well. You've got the little person. If you could work your building in with the person, that might be okay, and you wouldn't have to collage in a person after the fact. So that could be an advantage. Okay? So I'm thinking carefully about what I'm picking. Something like this would probably be pretty good. You've got a path over here. You've got the edge of the river, nice backdrop. It's nice and wide. This one would probably be pretty good. In this, I don't really have the opportunity to do too much with the reflection. So I probably won't do it, though this is closer and might end up being a little bit better. So I would keep that one actually on the table because you never know how these things turn out. Let's see. We'll go forward a little bit. We already did that. This one, a lot of people have used one like this or similar before with the little wooden pathway, the boardwalk. There's a few different versions of the Boardwalk, all of which can be useful because you can use that as part of the composition of the image. So if you remember back to the beginning of the class, we talked about photography and composition and all those kinds of things. Same thing applies here. If this is the key image that gets blown up to be big on your final presentation, composition is critical. You know, where's your building in conjunction with the rest? You know, do you have a strong diagonal? What's the backdrop? All those kinds of things. So, different example. This one doesn't really work because the rocks are too big. But the point is, I have to go through and I have to try a bunch of pieces to see which one is, you know, ultimately the right one. Where was that one? Okay, so this one is the one that I'm going to try. It would be nice if it was a little bit larger. I wonder if this one's a little bit larger. Yeah, that one's a little bit larger. But I told you I'd try this one, so we'll try this one first. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the image. And let me put it into my flash drive, into today's folder. And let me get a new folder here. And I'll go ahead and paste this into that folder. Now it's useful to kind of go ahead and open up this image a bit. And let's see if we can make this smaller. How nice. We'll go ahead and open it in Photoshop. Microsoft Paint's not doing its job for me here. Let me open with Photoshop CS6. And the reason that I'm going ahead and I'm opening up this image is because I want to see this image at the same time that I'm working with my SketchUp model. So I kind of have it over here on the side. I can press Control-0 and see the whole image. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up my SketchUp model. And I have to go back until I find the SketchUp model. Hold on a second. All right. So let me go into the perspective view. And I have a perspective view that's already been saved right there. But I'm going to start to manipulate this perspective view to be similar to the Photoshop view. So I'm going to pull them up side by side so that I can start to think about how do I want this set up. You know, for example, my building is probably going to need to swing over a bit, something like that. And to me, in this view, I've chopped off the vanishing point, so I have to kind of imagine it. For you, it might be easier to just toggle back and forth to see. But the critical thing here is that we have to get the two perspectives to match up. If you're struggling with the SketchUp perspective, one of the tricks that you can do is you can set, down here there's a little person with an X underneath it. That person with the X will set a person at ground level. And chances are the photograph you're picking from was taken at eye level because the person who photographed took it from that perspective. So you could approximate, oh, you know, I think my person's standing about here. And then you can use the look around tool to kind of look back at your building and figure out where your building goes. Okay? It works for some people. It helps. The other option is, of course, to go ahead and just swing your building naturally. The key is that you get your building established in its correct perspective with the vanishing points occurring at the right locations. So we have to go back and forth to this image. Obviously, I want my building to sit behind this tree right about in there. I need my zoom level to be appropriate. So I look at the height of the tree. The height of my building is probably about halfway up the tree. So you're kind of juggling all these things at once. If the perspective here ends up being off, it's not going to look right in the final image. So I'm going to get it close, and then I'll export it, and I'll do a test and see if it's close enough. Okay? So let's go ahead. I'm going to shift this slightly more, tip that up slightly. No, let's tip it down slightly, right about there. And then I'll do a file export 2D graphic. Notice I haven't saved the scene or anything yet because I want to make sure this actually works. So we'll drop it onto the flash drive. Oops. Into today's folder. and this is 130 fall 2016, and this is test. My options are still set at 5,000. We'll go ahead and say OK, and I'll export. Now, I haven't dealt with the lighting conditions. There's a lot of things that haven't been adjusted just yet, and that's because I want to make sure that it fits into this piece as well. So let's Control-0 to see the whole image. I'll go to File and then Place, and I'm going to drop that test image in. There it is. We'll place. I'll switch this to be in multiply mode so we can kind of see through. Screen might be a little easier. No. Let's try overlay. I'm going to go back to normal and then just adjust the opacity as I start to establish what looks right. So then I'll try to drop this into the scene so that it feels like it fits. Okay? So I wanted it to be about there as part of this. The problem, let's flip these two. I'll go ahead and say OK for a second. Let me flip these two. Layer from background. There we go. The problem here is that my building, it appears in this perspective like it's hanging out over the creek. So I need to adjust that perspective. So I'll go back here. I'm going to adjust that to be tipped a little bit more, about like that. And then we'll try this again. I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic. And you see why it's really important to find the image first, because obviously you have to adjust for the image. All right, so let's go ahead and delete this one. And I'll go to File and then Place. And we'll drop the second one in. And let's go, well, right, about like that. We'll drop it down. OK, that's not bad. We need to shrink this down just a little bit more. There. That could work. Let me look really quick at that edge. Move that back a little bit that way. There we go. So this looks about right to me. And again, I'm trying to line it up and what have you. So now that I feel comfortable with this setup here, I'm going to go ahead and go back to SketchUp. I'm going to take this and I'll save the scene. So I'll come over here into my scenes. I'm going to add one. And this new scene is going to be Perspective Fall 2016. And now I have that saved so I can come back to it. So now the next piece of this is to make the shadows line up correctly. And so the shadows that I have here are arbitrarily set. I want to go back to my original image. Let's turn this off for a second. And I want to look at how the shadows are falling. So here's the tree. The shadow, we can see a little bit of the tree shadow falling out into the creek here. The sun's certainly coming from this side, shining this direction. It's fairly close to noon because the shadows are fairly short. So I'm going to go back to my SketchUp file here, and I'm going to go to my shadows, and I'm going to adjust the time of day to be closer to noon. Time of year seems about right. I'm looking for the shadows again to match up. Similar here in length. Right? That's much taller, much shorter. So really, let me go back here. Let's adjust the time of year back so that those are a little bit shorter. Do you see how I'm working my way through that? Right? Maybe a little bit later in the day, right about like that. Okay, so I'm trying to make the shadows match up. Now I feel pretty good about the time of day. So now it's time to do the whole series of exports that we've been doing. So let me go ahead and go to View. Let me turn off my axes. Let me turn off my section cuts. Let me turn off my guides. Let me turn off my shadows. And I have just the basic line drawing to start. I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic. And we're going to save this one not as test, but as lines. And I'll click Export. This seems relatively familiar now. Okay. I'll go ahead and go to File, Export, or excuse me, let me turn into Hidden Line mode. So I'm going to go to my styles over here. I'm going to go to Edit, go to Faces, turn on X-ray. I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic. So there's lines, X-ray. I'll turn off X-ray. I did have a version where I did guides as well. My guides aren't really that exciting, so these dotted lines aren't going to do a lot for me. So I'm going to skip that one. All right, so we'll turn off the guides. Time to turn on the shadows, but then turn off the edges so that we have just the shadows. And I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic. And we'll call this one Shadows. And I'll export that as well. We turn back on the edges. And then I'm going to go ahead and switch to my sketchy edge styles. And I'll do my airbrush with endpoints. And once again, I have to turn off guides, section planes, section cuts, and shadows. And I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic. And this would be airbrush, export. And then I'll go to pen gray, and once again turn everything off again. And I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic. And export. OK, so now the logical assumption now that I have all those exports is, OK, well, it's time to bring in and go File, Place to all of these. If I do that, however, I'm going to have to resize every image to match up perfectly with this image. So it's a bit too much work. So instead of that, I'm going to go to File and then New. And then I'll File, Open the Lines version. There it is. And I'll drop in all of them here so that they're one on top of the other. Then I'll deal with the background. OK, so I'm trying to save myself a little bit of work. So we'll go ahead and go to File and then Place. And we'll drop in all the rest of these. So the next one was X-ray, File, Place. The next one was the airbrush, File, Place. We've got pen gray, File, Place. And we've got shadows. And you know what? One of the ones that I forgot to add, so I'll jump back here, is sometimes that color version when we're doing this will be make it easy to select all the glass because they're blue kind of thing. So let me go back to my default styles. And let's see which one works. That one will probably work. I'm going to go to Edit. I'm going to turn off Edges and Profiles so I have just the color. And then we'll turn off the section cuts, the section planes, the axes, and the guides. There we go, just color. And I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic. And I'll call this one Color. And Export. Then we'll jump back into Photoshop. One more, File, Place. We'll pick the color and drop that in as well. That's just for selection purposes. Makes selecting things a little bit easier. OK, so we'll take all of these and we'll make them multiply so that they stack up on top of each other. And from the background here, I'm going to right click and say Layer from Background. And we'll call this one Lines. And then I'll go through and rename my layers to make them clean. So X-ray, airbrush, pen gray, shadows, and color. Just to clean those up a little bit. And while I'm here, let's go ahead and take all of these and let's rasterize those layers so that they're no longer linked objects. That just saves me work down the road. OK, so now I have the bulk of my building brought in. Now it's time to bring that background image in. So I'll go to File and then Place. And we'll drop in the background image. Now chances are it's going to come in the wrong size, so we're going to have to go through and adjust our size. It may be useful in this process to switch to be in multiply mode so we can kind of see what's happening here. Right? We know that the building's going to sit about there in the scene. And let's go down just a little bit more. Let's go over a bit more. And right about there seems pretty good. So I'm setting that up for that background image, and I'll go ahead and click OK. Now you see when I drop this in, I lose parts of the image that are beyond the scope of this as they overlay. I want to get those back, so I'm going to go up to the Image menu, and I'm going to go to Canvas Size, and we'll peg the center as my anchor point, and I'm just going to make this bigger. So we'll say the height needs to be maybe 50, and the width needs to be, I don't know, 75. And I'll go ahead and say OK, and that will make my whole canvas bigger. And you see that I get a bunch of extra space around this. OK? This will then allow me to go to the crop window here, and I can crop down to the size of the photograph rather than the size of my original drawings. So there I am at the photograph size. I'll click the little check mark to say OK, and now I'm set at the size of the photograph. So let's take the photograph, switch it back to normal mode, drop it to the back of the stack here. And then once I have this established, obviously, first thing that I need to do is I need to cut out or mask off for this building so that it starts to feel like it's part of the ground. So I need to do a selection. We'll use the lines layer. I'll use the magic wand. I'll select everything that's outside of my building. There it is. I'll do a select and then inverse. And then I need to add back this part of the image. Oops, let me Control, Alt, subtract that, and that from the selection. So I have just the dotted line around the building itself. Now, the logical thing would be to, OK, well, I have this as part of the building. We can be on this piece. Let me rasterize it. And then I'll just press delete, and that part will go away. Okay, and then my building will show up nicely right there, and life is great. Right? We could even go to multiply. Oops, sorry. And all is good. But wait a minute, I cut out this whole tree. I cut out this part of the tree. I cut out the little bit of ground that's over here. Doesn't quite work. Okay, so I have two methods of going about it. Let me jump back a few steps here. Okay, so I have my selection. The first thing that I could do is I could mask this, which might not be a bad strategy. Okay, so I could click the Add Layer Mask on this layer. Oops, sorry, I have to invert. I could go to Select, and then I could go to Inverse, and I could add the layer mask that way. Okay, this allows me to go back and add the tree in, etc. But instead of doing that, right, let's go ahead and start to refine the edge. Remember way back when we isolated objects and we refined the edge? Okay, let me get close to this edge because the building's going to go behind that tree. So I'll use the lasso tool, right, and I'm going to add to the selection. I just want to make sure that I do this correctly. Yeah, good. I'm going to add to the selection, and I'm going to draw right along this edge. You could use the magic wand, but there's not much difference between this foreground object and the background object. We'll come down here like this. All right, so I added that piece to it. We're going to come over to the middle here, and we're going to try to add some of the tree. So we'll add this piece like that. We'll add this selection there, add this selection here, right? And I told you I set myself up to make this a challenging one, so bear with me while we go through it. All right, so I'm picking the key components where we can see through the tree. And then I'll go through and I'll drag along the edge. Get down to the bottom. Just going to go up like this. All right. And let me work my way down this side. All right, and then I did this backwards. Some of these need to be added back in. OK, so you see how I've gone through and I've done that. The next thing is I can click on the Refine Edge button. And if you remember back to this, remember we set our radius at 0.3, or radius was at 1, the smooth was at 3, and the feather was at 0.3, if I'm not mistaken. Right? And then it was a matter of choosing which one to work with. So we'll go ahead and do on black for a second, and I'm just going to paint in this area right in here, and it should start to feather out. See how that's feathering right along the edge? That's what I want it to do. So we'll go right along the edge there. Right along that edge. Along this edge. That. All right, and then once we get to the point where we've identified this selection, like that, we can say OK, and we now have the selection. And then I can click on the Add Layer Mask. Oh, sorry, I should have done this edge too. So let me go back to Refine Edge really fast, and we're just going to work right along here. All right, so we have that little bit of Refine Edge. I'll say OK. And then we can go ahead and click on the Add Layer Mask. And I'm doing it via Layer Mask so I can see what's happened, and then I can work my way through some of the rest of the building. So if I turn on my lines, and we change the lines to be in multiply mode, we can start to see that the building is going behind this. There's a few pieces that I need to work through with the tree to kind of clean up. Like that little blue patch shouldn't be there. That should be white, etc. So I still have some work to do on this. But you can see, certainly on this side, that it's doing a pretty good job of showing through where the tree would be. And the tree is, in fact, in front of the building. Does that make sense so far? OK. So now that I have this in place, right, I need to use some kind of like a grass brush to make this feel like it's integral to the scene. So I'm going to go ahead and make a copy of this image. So before I do that, I should have rasterized this. Oh, we'll see if it'll let me do it anyway. I'm just going to take a rectangular piece at the bottom of my building, about like that. Oops. There we go. I'm going to edit, copy, and I'm going to edit, paste, which should give me an identical copy of the bottom of my building. Right, we can drop this up a little bit in the layer stack. Let me use my lines turn this off so you can see. Let me select, all right, this. We'll go to select inverse, and I'll go ahead and cut this. Oops. I'm going to cut this piece out. I'm using this piece to do my clone stamping at the bottom. All right, and it'll make sense in just a second. So if I turn this on, it's seamless to the background, except that this piece is in front of everything else. So when I clone stamp, it will go along the edge. So we'll turn this off. I'll use my clone stamp with the grass brush. Let me zoom in here a little bit. Alt copies from, and I want to start copying the grass along that edge. Probably need to be back just a little bit more. Right, and so we can do the grass along that edge. It's going to work better in some places than in others. This grayish piece, see how I'm getting the tails of the grass? It doesn't look so good. Let me take the grass from over here and cover that up like that. Probably need to take a little bit in here and cover that up. So it's going to take a little bit of work to get the right combination of how these combine together. Let's take a little bit in the front there. Something like that. Take a little bit more from over here. We'll cover up that section. And then let me take this, oops, Alt here, and we'll copy over into that. See, I'm kind of working my way through to cover up the bottoms and to get these pieces to feel like they integrate with one another along the center of this. Right? So something like that. In reality, the back, the grass at the back is going to have to be a little bit smaller than the grass at the front. Right? Let's work our way along here a little bit. I'll hold down Alt, and we'll try to copy from about there. And we'll work our way along the front. Okay, then we get into the shadows. So we'll have a little bit of the dark grass in there, like that. At that point, it's probably also useful to turn back on my mask to see where the tree falls in relation to this. So we'll go ahead and make sure that we use the shadow to our advantage there against the building, like so. In this section, we have a little bit of some bushes that are kind of in here, but I'm going to go ahead and use the grass to kind of cover that up. So once again, I'll go back to my clone stamp grass brush, but I'm going to make the brush a little bit taller, and we'll work our way through this section of the building as well. This is a little bit smaller, so I'll make the brush a little bit smaller. Oops. And again, this is a critical part of how do you get the building to feel like it's grounded. Right? So there it is from further away, but you can see that the grass is starting to make it feel like the building's a piece of the site, rather than if I take this away, it looks like it's floating on top of the background image. Does that make sense, the difference between the two? So you want to take your time with the grass and make sure you cover up that lower edge so that it really feels like it's integral to this scene as a whole. Let me press Control+ again. Right? And like I said, I need to go through and get rid of a little bit more of the tree, but we'll get to that part a little bit later. So now that I have that established, I have the grass in its place. I'm going to go ahead and work my way through and start to collage in some of the rest of the building. So let's start with a concrete texture for the background. I used those tiles last time. I think I'm going to actually try to get a better concrete. So let's do concrete. Of course not. Let's do images. All right, I want this to be relatively rustic, so I'm going to use a board form style texture. Let's see what looks good. Let me do, under search tools, I'm going to go to size, and I'm going to say larger than, so that I have an idea of the size. And I'm just looking. Oh, it looks pretty good. Yeah, I like that as a texture. Okay, so I'll go ahead and I'll save this. Save image as. We'll save it into my same folder. So let's go into my 130 folder. I'll save it. And now I'm going to go ahead and place that into my drawing. So I'll go to File and then Place. And I'll drop this into place. There it is. Obviously, it's much larger than I need it to be. So we'll use the Free Transform tool. Sorry, it's already in Free Transform. And I'm going to scale this down. And what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the edge of the building to have the right scale. So if this is a 6-inch board, right, this is going to have to be smaller. It's probably about there or so as part of this texture. So I'm going to do this wall with this image. So I'll go ahead, it's a little bit larger, I'll go ahead and say OK. There it is. And if it helps you see it, you could go multiply mode so you can kind of see how it overlaps. I'm going to keep it solid for right now. And then I will select this, copy, Control-C, followed by paste, Control-V. I get a second version of it. And because I looked up tiling texture, they tile seamlessly, which is the idea. And let me do a third one right there. Let me do one there, one there, and one there. And let's do one more at the bottom here. There, there, and there. So I deliberately made these much larger than I needed. And actually, I could go, let me go back to my canvas size. And we'll go this at about 60. I just want you to see the whole thing. OK, so now I have all of these board form textures together. They came in as this whole set. I'm going to merge those layers together. So I right-click, and I say Merge Layers. They're now one layer, layer 9. And let's call this Concrete Texture 1. There it is. And now this doesn't really match up with my building just yet. And let's switch it to be, I'm actually just going to adjust the opacity so you can see through a little bit, like that. It's not in perspective. It's flat. So I need to change that. So I'm going to go into my Edit. I'm going to go to Transform, and I'm going to go to Skew. And now I can adjust this line down to match up with this part of the building. I can adjust this line up to match the bottom part of the building. And I really need to make this a little bit shorter. So let's make this a little bit shorter. Something like that. And as I start to do this, let me adjust that opacity a little bit more. You can start to see that the perspective of my texture matches up with my building. Does that make sense how I did that? Okay. So let's make it a little bit shorter. Let's make this a little bit shorter, right about like that. This needs to come up just a little bit. And I'm looking at a variety of places to make sure that that lines up. This needs to get a little bit shorter right there. That looks pretty good. I'll go ahead and confirm it so that I have it in place. And now I need to mask it. So let's go back to my lines layer. I can use my magic wand to select those two pieces of wall. We can go back up to the concrete texture layer. We can turn it on, and I can click on the Add Layer Mask. And I've now masked for that part of the building. Now, this needs to go below layer 1, which is the grass. So we'll call this Grass Overlay. And that's going to stay on top. So now I have the concrete texture on this part of the building. I can adjust my opacity back up, and I have that piece of concrete on the side of the building. It's time to start doing that again for this piece of the building and for this front of the building. So once again, I'll go to File and then Place. I can use the same concrete texture. There it is. We'll adjust that opacity temporarily, and then we'll adjust the size of it. And now that I've established the size for one of them, it's just a matter of making the sizes line up, right? Because obviously if the board is a certain size on one side, it needs to be the same size on another side. So we'll shrink those down. And now they're approximately the right size. They match up. And then we can go ahead and commit to it. And then I'll do the same process where I take this image, copy, Control-C, Control-V, get multiple versions of it, and we line those versions up. That's enough there. We'll go to there, go to there. These get merged together. Right-click, merge. Why is it not there? Merge layers. There it is. All right, then I can take this, same thing. We'll go to Edit and then Skew. Oh, I needed to adjust that opacity. They weren't the same, so hold on a second. It needs to go back to 100%. There we go. Those, merge layers, Edit, Skew, transform, Skew, and then we can adjust that opacity so we can see through. And then it's a matter of getting this to match up. Shrink this down a little bit to there. Shrink this down a little bit to there. And then we'll drop this down a bit in perspective. We'll drop this one up a bit in perspective. This needs to come down a little bit. Needs to come down a little bit. Something like that. So we find where that happy medium point is. Once we have that, we need to mask it off. So I'll turn off. Let me click OK. And then I'll select, oops, let me go to my lines, sorry. I'll magic wand this piece. And technically this layer here would be a different level. So I should do it again for this level. But for the sake of time, I'll go ahead and do it here. And we can do it, sorry, not right there. Right, so I have this front and that face. And then we can go ahead and go back up to my concrete texture here. And we can mask that part of it as well. So you see how I build the texture on the side of the building. Okay, and I would work my way around. So I have that established now. The grass overlay is still in front. It matches up nicely with my background with my tree. And then I would need to go ahead and maybe do the sky for the windows. So we've done that one before. I'll go to File and then Place. And I'll find a picture of the sky. And I believe I had it a couple collages back. No, it wasn't that one. Thought I had it. Hold on. There's the sky. Place that in. Control minus. Zoom out a bit. Make this smaller. Now this might not be the best choice for the window reflection because the sky here is perfectly clear, but we'll do it anyway. Okay, so I'll make that a little bit bigger. We'll turn everything off, commit to it, turn everything off like that, except for the lines layer, and turn this off. And then I'm going to select all of the windows. So we'll say this plus this and that, this, this. I have to zoom in here a little bit. All right, so now I have all those pieces selected. We can go back to my sky, and we can use a layer mask there to cut out for just the windows. Okay, so now I have those windows selected. Maybe the opacity there needs to go down a little bit so they're not quite as bright. Maybe something like that. So we can turn on the grass overlay again, and we can work our way back up. So with the shadows, right? I need to make sure that my shadows are applying onto the ground. So I'm actually going to move the shadows all the way up, oops, to the very top, even on top of the overlay, the grass overlay. So we'll put those all the way up at the very top so that my shadows are then applying here. Just like we did before when we did the people, my shadows need to be integrated so they're not sharp with the grass. So let's turn everything off except for my shadows. And I'm going to use my clone stamp, again with my grass brush. I'll hold down Alt to copy the edge of white, and we'll put that edge along the front edge of my grass. Work this way. Like that. If I'm doing the back edge, it would be copied from this gray color, and we'd be going along the back edge to soften that up. Oops, sorry about that. A lot of times you have to copy and keep readjusting the copy from point. All right, and in reality, I should have done the gray first, and then I should do the white going this way to cover up the gray. Something like that. I got a little bit more gray in the back here that needs to be done. Okay, so when I do that, and it now goes over the grass overlay, it starts to feel like it's part of the grass rather than a sharp edge. And obviously, I need to spend a little bit more time, and I need to work through the shadows down here to make them integrate as well. So it's this snowball of things, right? You work through different pieces of it. Let's go ahead and turn everything back on except for the color version there. We'll press Control-0, and you can start to see it's integrating in. Okay, so I told you that I wanted to make the reflection happen. So the reflection's a little bit tricky because we need to save a version of this without the background that matches up with all of my textures. So I'll leave this the grass at the edge here, and let me make sure that I have everything on except the background, and I'll go to File, Save As, and I'm going to save this as a JPEG. The reason that I need this is I need it where everything's combined together. The clouds match, everything matches. So we'll go ahead and save this into my folder. This is going to be my reflection, and I'll click Save. Then we can turn this back on, and then I'll go to File and then Place. Actually, let me open the reflection first. And I'm going to select the background, and we'll get rid of that background. Oops, let me layer from background. No. All right. Right click, layer from background. Yes, get rid of that. I'm going to crop it down just so I don't have a bunch of excess parts here. And really, all I care about is right on the building itself. About like that. And about like that. OK, so now I have that piece of the building that's going to be my reflection piece. I'll go ahead and save it. And yeah, we'll just override it as reflection. Let me make it a PNG this time so the background stays transparent. I'll click Save and OK. Then we'll go back to the original. And one of the cool things about the way reflections work is if you look, they're straight on with where the camera is, right? So the camera's looking straight across. So doing the reflection is actually fairly easy. I'll go to File and then Place. I'll take my reflection. Let me make sure it's a PNG. There. I'll click Place. There it is. I need to reflect this, so I'll go to Edit, Transform. I'm going to flip vertical so that we're looking at it this way. Right? We'll drop it down, and it's going to line up right about there for the water. Okay? So we're going to get that reflection in the water. Obviously, the edge, we're not going to get reflection unless it is, in fact, water. So before I get too far along, oops, looks like when I placed it, it wasn't quite in line. And make sure it gets in line there. Let me turn it off for just a second. And I'm going to cut right along the edge of the water. So let me do a selection. I'll zoom in. And we'll go right along the edge of the water here. Oops. About like that, right along the edge of the water. And then I can go back to my reflection, and we can use my mask, my add layer mask, to make sure that it appears just right on the edge of the water. Do you guys see how I'm kind of working through that? Okay. Now, it's definitely too strong in its reflection. If we look at the reflection in the water, it's much softer. Okay, so we need to make some adjustments. Number one, we can adjust the opacity down a bit so that it starts to feel like it's more of a reflection. Yeah?
Don't you also want to cut around the rock?
Yes, thank you. I need to cut around the rock. I didn't see the rock. So let me go back. Let's turn this off. Yes, the rock, obviously, there isn't going to be a reflection there. So we'll zoom in. That's the advantage of the layer mask, because we can come back in after the fact, and I can work my way around this rock. If I were doing this not in front of you, I would spend a little bit more time than I'm spending doing these cutouts. But I don't want you to have to sit and watch me perfect everything. So let's go back to my mask on this layer. I'll paint in black over that section so that the rock shines through. Thank you for catching that. Okay? So now I have my reflection, right? I have some opacity, but it's still very sharp. Okay? So let's click on the image itself. I'm going to right-click. Oh, come on. And let me rasterize that layer so that it's workable. And then I'm going to come over here, and it's underneath this. So it's right here. It's the blur tool. Okay? And what the blur tool does is it's a brush that will allow us to start to blur the image itself. So let me turn off everything so that you guys can see this work. Let me adjust the opacity back to 100%, right? And then as I work across it, increase the strength here a little bit. And of course, you love it when stuff doesn't do what it's supposed to do when I'm trying to do it. Let me make the brush a little bit bigger. It's happening, but I don't know if you can see it. Do you guys see how it's blurring out a little bit? Okay, so I'm going to go through and I'm going to blur this. So that it's not quite so sharp. I'm going to clip off this corner here. And then we'll go back to my blur. There, we'll do a little bit more blur. Right? The other thing that you can do is you can use the smudge tool to add some streaks to it. Get a little bit bigger. So I usually start with the blur, and then we work our way through some streaks. The reason those streaks help is because the water has ripples in it. So we can move back a little bit, and I'll add a few little streaks. All right, let's increase the brush size. All right, so there's some balance that's the right amount. Okay? And again, I wanted that to be somewhat transparent. So I think I was at about 50%, something like that. And then we'll turn everything back on except for the color. And you can start to see how this is starting to integrate with the rest of this as a reflection. Still probably a little bit strong in comparison. So we'll adjust that opacity down a little bit more till it feels about right. Looks like we're going to need a few more smudges as part of this. So I'll go back to smudge. I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller because a lot of the waves are a little bit smaller, and we'll work our way through. Right. I still need to work a little bit on that edge because it's not really, I didn't do a good job of cutting it out, so I should work on the mask and that sort of thing. But if we zoom back a little bit, we can start to see that now not only do I have the building, but I have the reflection as part of it. Okay. So at this point, it's getting there. I would do some touch up. It would also be not a bad idea to put a person into the scene. So I could maybe add a person standing right here. I'll go to File and then Place. And I'm going to have to drop in a person. I'll use the same person from last class right there. And so let's take him. We'll place him. There he is. I should have done his color version. Right? And in reality, he's not looking at the building, so I really should pick somebody who's looking at the building. But compositionally, it wouldn't be bad to have a person. Right? Remember, eye line is about wherever the horizon line is. So if I want them to stand in the foreground, their eye level is going to be about there. So we can establish the person there. I'll click OK, and there he is integrated as part of the building. I should add his shadow. Right? It's coming toward us, so we're not going to see it. Is his lighting correct? No. This side of his face is lit. We need the opposite. So this is not the right person for it. But you're getting the idea of how I'm trying to do it. But remember, I'm watching where the shadows and the lights go to make this an integral part of the overall building. Okay? So is this making sense? I know there's a lot of steps as part of this, but this is really when you can make your building look great and create that showpiece as part of your overall design. So hopefully this gives you a trajectory of where you're going. Remember, for your assignment 107, your final, you need a plan, a section, a perspective, or a elevation. You need 3 of those 4. Right? So if you don't like how one of them turns out, that's OK. You'll have the rest of the class day to work on a perspective. And then next week, we'll spend some time revisiting portfolios and getting you caught up. Are there any questions? Yeah.
What proportion of the whole scene would you say the house should be to scenery?
It's a good question. So the question is, what proportion of the house to the overall scene is appropriate? And it depends a little bit on your vision. Is this a really, this is out in the middle of a beautiful, spectacular landscape. You want to show more of the beautiful, spectacular landscape. If you're in more of an urban context where the streets are narrower and you want to see buildings on either side, it's a smaller, narrower view. So it's generally dependent on the context of the building as to how much you want to show. The other thing that you need is you need to make sure that the original image is of a quality that can support however much you need. So in this case, the original image itself, if I blow it up too much and try to print it, it starts to get pixelated in contrast to my actual SketchUp building. So at some level, they don't really match up. So you have to think about how big do you want it, how big do you want your building to appear on the final poster, and do you have the imagery to support that in its appropriate size. So I guess the long answer is that it depends on the actual context of the building, but it's a good question nonetheless.
Position of the sign could be either side or in the middle.
Right. It's the position-wise, it's based on composition. So what feels right compositionally as to where it should go and where it shouldn't go. And so you have to decide what's the appropriate place for it, and then go from there. All right. Any other questions? No? All right. I'll turn you loose.